Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates spent their weekends at the mall or gossiping about boys, she could be found at the local shooting range with her father, a retired Marine. The smell of gunpowder and the sharp crack of rifles firing had become as familiar to her as her mother's perfume. Growing up in a small Texas town, Sarah learned early that being a girl who loved guns made her an oddity. Her father, Carlos Martinez, had served 3 tours in Iraq and came back with stories that would make most people's blood run cold. But for Sarah, these weren't horror stories. They were lessons about courage, precision, and the weight of responsibility that came with holding a weapon. By the time she turned 16, Sarah could outshoot most of the adult men at the range. Her hands were steady, her aim was true, and her understanding of firearms went far beyond just pulling a trigger. She knew the mechanics, the maintenance, and most importantly, the respect these tools demanded. The other teenagers at school thought she was weird, but Sarah didn't care. She had found her passion. When graduation day arrived, Sarah surprised everyone, including her parents, by announcing she wanted to join the Navy. Not just any part of the Navy. She wanted to become a Navy SEAL. The room fell silent when she made this declaration at their family barbecue. Her Uncle Miguel nearly choked on his beer, and her grandmother crossed herself and muttered a prayer in Spanish. "Mija," her father said gently. "You know women can't be SEALs, right?" Sarah's jaw tightened. She had done her research. She knew the rules, the barriers, and the seemingly impossible odds. But she also knew that rules had a way of changing, especially when people were determined enough to change them. "Not yet, Papa," she replied. "But things are different now. They're starting to let women try for combat roles." The next few months were filled with intense preparation. Sarah threw herself into physical training with the same dedication she had shown. At the shooting range, she ran before dawn, lifted weights until her muscles screamed, and swam laps in the community pool until the lifeguards told her to go home. Her body transformed from that of a typical teenage girl into something lean, powerful, and purposeful. Her mother, Rosa, watched with a mixture of pride and terror. She had married a warrior, and now her daughter wanted to follow the same path. The sleepless nights began early, even before Sarah had officially enlisted. Rosa would lie awake thinking about all the ways the military could break her baby girl, all the dangers she would face, and all the men who would doubt her every step of the way. When Sarah finally walked into the Navy recruitment office, Petty, Officer Johnson looked up from his paperwork and almost laughed. The girl standing before him was maybe 5 feet 6 inches tall and couldn't weigh more than 140 pounds soaking wet. She had dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and eyes that seemed too serious for someone who had just turned 18. "Let me guess," Johnson said with a smirk. "You want to be a yeoman or maybe work in communications?" Sarah placed her hands flat on his desk and leaned forward slightly. "I want to be a Navy SEAL." This time Johnson did laugh. Not a chuckle or a polite snort, but a full belly laugh that brought tears to his eyes. "Sweetheart, I've been doing this job for 15 years and I've seen exactly 0 women make it through SEAL training. Hell, I've seen grown men, professional athletes, guys who could bench press a car, wash out in the first week." Sarah didn't flinch. She had expected this reaction. In fact, she had practiced her response in the mirror at home. "Then I guess I'll be the first." The paperwork took hours. Johnson kept trying to steer her toward more suitable roles for women. In the Navy. He showed her brochures for intelligence work, medical corps, and logistics. Each time, Sarah politely declined and pointed back to the SEAL application. Finally, with the resignation of a man who had given up trying to talk sense into a stubborn teenager, Johnson processed her application. Basic training at Great Lakes was Sarah's first real taste of military life. The drill instructors were hard on everyone, but they seemed to take special pleasure in making the few women in her division miserable. Sarah endured it all, the screaming, the impossible physical demands, the constant attempts to make her quit. She watched other recruits break down and cry, saw tough guys from inner cities reduced to whimpering children, and witnessed more than a few people simply disappear in the night, unable to handle the pressure. But Sarah thrived. Every insult, every challenge, every attempt to break her spirit only made her more determined. When Petty Officer Reynolds screamed that she was too weak to carry a wounded sailor to safety, Sarah volunteered to carry 2 sailors during the next drill. When Chief Martinez suggested she might be happier in a desk job, Sarah asked for extra, physical training sessions. Her fellow recruits began to notice. At first, some of the men resented her presence, muttering that the military was going soft by letting women into combat roles. But as weeks passed and Sarah consistently outperformed many of them, attitudes began to shift. She became the person others came to for help with weapons maintenance. When someone struggled with marksmanship, Sarah would offer quiet tips and encouragement during their limited free time. The shooting range was where Sarah truly shined. The first time she picked up the standard issue M16, the range instructor barely looked up from his clipboard. Another recruit trying to impress everyone, he thought. But when Sarah's shots grouped so tightly they looked like one ragged hole, in the center of the target, everyone stopped what they were doing. "Martinez!" the instructor shouted. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "My father taught me, sir," Sarah replied, keeping her eyes forward. The instructor walked over to examine her target more closely. In 20 years of training recruits, he had rarely seen such precision, especially from someone firing the weapon for the first time in a military setting. Word spread quickly through the training division. The girl from Texas could really shoot. As basic training neared its end, Sarah's reputation had grown. She wasn't just the girl who wanted to be a SEAL anymore. She was the recruit who never quit, never complained, and could outshoot almost anyone on the range. But she also knew that basic training was just the beginning. The real test was still ahead of her, and it would be unlike anything she had ever faced. The Naval Special Warfare Preparatory School in Great Lakes was Sarah's next stop, and it was here that reality hit her like a cold wave. The building itself looked ordinary enough, just another military facility with plain concrete walls and fluorescent lights. But inside those walls, dreams were systematically destroyed and rebuilt into something harder, more resilient. Sarah arrived on a Monday morning in January, and the Illinois wind cut through her uniform like a knife. She carried a single duffel bag containing everything she owned that mattered. Inside the building, she joined 23 other sailors who had somehow convinced their chain of command that they were ready for the most elite training the Navy had to offer. The group was an interesting mix. There was Rodriguez from Losi, Angeles, a former gang member who had found salvation in the military. Thompson from Alabama stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and looked like he could wrestle a bull. Jackson had been a college football player before an injury ended his sports career and led him to the Navy. And then there was Sarah, the only woman in the room, standing quietly in the corner and trying not to attract attention. Instructor. Chief Petty Officer Williams walked into the room at exactly 800 hours. He was a man who seemed to be carved from granite, with scars on his hands that told stories of real combat and eyes that had seen too much. Williams had been a SEAL for 12 years before an injury moved him to training duty. He looked over the assembled group with the expression of a man examining cattle at auction. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "welcome to the place where your fantasies come to die. Over the next 8 weeks, we're going to find out who among you has what it takes to even attempt SEAL training, and who should go back to painting ships or serving food in the galley." His gaze stopped on Sarah, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical thing. "I see we have a female candidate this time," he said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "That's interesting." The snickers from some of her classmates were barely concealed. Sarah kept her eyes forward and her expression neutral, but inside, she felt the familiar fire building. She had been dealing with doubt and condescension her entire life, and she wasn't about to let it stop her now. The first week was designed to separate the dreamers from the truly committed. Physical training began at 500 hours every day, starting with a 4-mile run that left half the class gasping and stumbling. Sarah had prepared for this, running similar distances back home, but the pace here was brutal. The instructors didn't care if you were tired, hurt, or struggling to keep up. Fall behind and you were gone. Swimming came next, and this was where Sarah faced her first real challenge. Growing up in Texas, she had learned to swim in community pools and lakes, but she had never experienced anything like the Navy's version of aquatic training. They weren't just expected to swim laps. They had to perform complex underwater maneuvers, hold their breath for extended periods, and complete tasks while completely submerged. On her third day in the pool, Sarah thought she might drown. The exercise was simple in concept. Swim to the bottom of the 12-foot deep pool, retrieve a weighted object, and bring it back to the surface. But simple wasn't the same as easy. The weight was heavier than expected, and by the time Sarah reached the bottom, her lungs were already burning. Halfway back to the surface, her vision started to blur and panic crept in around the edges of her mind. Thompson, who had been watching from the pool side, later told her that he was sure she was going to have to be pulled out. But somehow Sarah made it to the surface, gasping and coughing but still holding the weight. Instructor Martinez, who was running the pool session, made a note on his clipboard but said nothing. The weapons training was where Sarah expected to excel, and she wasn't disappointed. The Navy used different firearms than what she had learned but the principles were the same. Breath control, sight alignment, trigger squeeze. Her father's lessons served her well. But the instructors here weren't just interested in marksmanship. They wanted to see how the candidates handled weapons under stress, in uncomfortable positions, and while exhausted. During one particularly challenging exercise, the class had to complete a grueling obstacle course and then immediately move to the shooting range. They were given 30 seconds to engage multiple targets at various distances, while their hands shook from fatigue and their hearts pounded from exertion. Most of the class struggled to hit anything, their shots scattered across the targets like buckshot. Sarah's first shot hit the bullseye, so did her second, third, and fourth. By the time she had engaged all 6 targets, she had achieved what the instructors called a perfect run, every shot in the kill zone, completed in under 20 seconds. The range fell silent. Instructor Williams walked over to examine Sarah's targets personally. He had seen thousands of sailors come through these programs, and very few could shoot accurately under such conditions. Even fewer could do it consistently. He looked at Sarah, who was still breathing hard from the obstacle course, and for the first time since she had arrived, his expression showed something other than skepticism. "Where did you learn to shoot, Martinez?" he asked. "My father taught me, Chief. He's a retired Marine." Williams nodded slowly. Marines were known for their marksmanship, and it showed. But shooting was only part of what made a SEAL. The real test was still coming. The psychological pressure was constant and deliberate. The instructors used every tool at their disposal to make the candidates quit. They would wake them up in the middle of the night for surprise inspections, make them do push-ups until their arms gave out, and constantly remind them that they didn't have what it takes. The verbal abuse was particularly intense for Sarah. "Martinez, you're holding back the whole team," Instructor Davis would shout during PT sessions. "Maybe you should go home and let your mommy make you some cookies." The comments about her gender were relentless. She was too weak, too small, too emotional. She didn't belong here with the real warriors. Some of the other candidates tried to defend her, but Sarah quickly put a stop to that. She didn't want anyone's protection or pity. She would sink or swim on her own merits. By the 4th week, the original class of 24 had been reduced to 16. Rodriguez had quit after failing the swimming requirements for the 3rd time. 2 others had been removed due to injuries, and several more had simply decided that military life wasn't for them. But Sarah remained, and she was starting to earn respect from unlikely sources. Jackson, the former football player who had initially been one of her harshest critics, approached her after a particularly difficult training session. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I didn't think you belonged here. I was wrong." Sarah looked at him with surprise. Jackson was one of the strongest performers in the class, and his opinion carried weight with the other candidates. "You don't owe me anything," she replied. "Just keep pushing yourself. We're all in this together." That night, as Sarah lay in her narrow bunk listening to the sounds of her classmates sleeping, she thought about her father. She wondered what he would think of her progress so far. She had come further than most people thought possible, but she knew the real test was still ahead. SEAL training itself made this preparatory school look like a vacation, and she would need every ounce of strength, skill, and determination she possessed to make it through. The doubt was always there, whispering in the quiet moments. Maybe they were right. Maybe she wasn't strong enough, tough enough, or good enough to make it. But every time those thoughts crept in, Sarah remembered the laughter in the recruitment office, the smirks from her classmates, and the constant reminders that she didn't belong. That memory was fuel for the fire that burned inside her, and, as long as that fire kept burning, she would keep moving forward. The Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, California, was a world away from the flat plains of Texas where Sarah had grown up. Palm trees swayed in the ocean breeze, and the Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon. But Sarah wasn't there to enjoy the scenery. She was there for basic underwater demolition SEAL training, known throughout the military simply as BUD-S, the most demanding military training program in the world. Standing on the beach at 0500 hours on her first morning, Sarah looked out at her new class. 230 men had reported for training, and once again she was the only woman. The statistics were sobering. Only about 20% of those who started BUD-S would actually graduate. The rest would ring the bell that stood prominently in the center of the compound, officially ending their SEAL dreams forever. The instructors at BUD-S were a different breed entirely from what Sarah had encountered before. These weren't just sailors who had been assigned to training duty. These were active SEALs who rotated through instructor positions while maintaining their operational status. They had been in real combat, had faced real enemies, and they weren't interested in playing games with candidates who weren't absolutely serious about becoming SEALs. Instructor Chief Petty Officer Morrison was Sarah's first introduction to this new level of intensity. Morrison was a legend in the SEAL community, a man who had been on more classified missions than most people had hot meals. He walked among the new class like a predator studying prey, and when his eyes fell on Sarah, she felt the weight of 20 years of combat experience evaluating her worth. "So you're the female candidate I've been hearing about," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the waves. "Martinez, right? From Texas?" "Yes, Chief," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady. Morrison circled her slowly, like a shark. "I've seen your scores from preparatory school. Impressive marksmanship, decent physical performance, no major disciplinary issues." He paused directly in front of her. "But this isn't prep school anymore, Martinez. This is the real thing. And I've never seen a woman make it through my class." The other candidates were watching this exchange with interest. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed amused, and a few appeared openly hostile. Sarah knew that every response she gave in these first few moments would shape how she was perceived for the rest of training. "I understand that, Chief," she replied. "I'm not here to be the first woman to graduate BUD-S. I'm here to become a SEAL." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly at this response. Most candidates, especially when singled out on their first day, tried to blend back into the crowd as quickly as possible. But Sarah had essentially announced that she intended to succeed, not just survive. It was either confident or foolish, and Morrison would find out which over the coming weeks. The first phase of BUD-S was designed to push candidates to their absolute physical and mental limits. The days began with a 4-mile run on the beach, conducted at a pace that would challenge collegiate cross-country runners. Sarah had prepared for this, but running in soft sand while wearing boots and carrying gear was different from any training she had done before. By the end of the first week, her legs felt like concrete pillars and her lungs burned constantly. But it was the calisthenics that really separated the strong from the weak. Push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, and dips were performed, until muscle failure wasn't just likely, it was guaranteed. The instructors would stand over struggling candidates, shouting encouragement that sounded more like abuse, pushing everyone to find reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. Sarah's smaller frame was both an advantage and a disadvantage. She weighed less than most of her classmates, which helped with exercises like pull-ups and climbing. But when they had to carry heavy boats over their heads or move massive logs as a team, Her size became a liability. She compensated by working harder than anyone else, volunteering for the most difficult positions, and never asking for help even when she clearly needed it. The ocean was where Bud-S candidates learned to love and hate water in equal measure. Every day brought new aquatic challenges: long swims in cold Pacific waters, underwater knot-tying exercises that left candidates gasping for air, and treading water while performing complex tasks. Sarah's swimming had improved dramatically during prep school, but the ocean was an entirely different environment. During one particularly brutal surf passage exercise, candidates had to work in teams to carry their rubber boats through massive waves, navigate to a point offshore, and then return through the surf. Sarah's team consisted of 6 men who outweighed her by at least 50 pounds each. When a 12-foot wave caught their boat and flipped it like a toy, Sarah found herself tumbling underwater with no sense of direction. Panic was the enemy in situations like this. Sarah forced herself to stop fighting the water and let her natural buoyancy bring her to the surface. When she broke through, gasping and disoriented, she saw that one of her teammates was in trouble. Petty Officer Williams, a stocky sailor from Michigan, was thrashing in the water about 20 yards away, clearly struggling against the current. Without hesitation, Sarah swam toward him. Williams outweighed her by almost 80 pounds, and swimming with another person in rough ocean conditions was dangerous even for experienced swimmers. But SEALs didn't leave teammates behind, and Sarah wasn't about to start making exceptions. "Relax and let me pull you," she shouted over the noise of the waves. Williams was too exhausted to argue. Sarah positioned herself behind him and began swimming toward shore, fighting the current every inch of the way. It took 15 minutes to reach shallow water, and both of them collapsed on the sand, completely spent. Instructor Morrison had watched the entire rescue from the beach. That night, he made a note in Sarah's training file. Candidate demonstrated leadership and commitment to team welfare under difficult conditions. No hesitation to risk personal safety for teammate. But for every moment of triumph, there were dozens of moments when Sarah questioned whether she could continue. The physical demands were only part of the challenge. The mental pressure was constant and unrelenting. Instructors would wake them up at random hours for surprise inspections, make them perform push-ups in the surf until they could barely move their arms, and constantly remind them that they could quit at any time simply by walking over and ringing the bell. The bell was visible from almost everywhere in the compound, a constant reminder that escape was just a few steps away. Sarah would sometimes catch herself looking at it during the worst moments, when her body was screaming in protest, when the instructors seemed determined to break her spirit, when the voice in her head whispered that she had already proven her point and could leave with dignity intact. But she never took those steps toward the bell. Instead, she developed mental strategies to survive the worst moments. During impossible physical challenges, she would break the task down into smaller, manageable pieces. Instead of thinking about completing a 5-mile run, she would focus on reaching the next telephone pole, then the next one after that. When instructors were screaming abuse at her, she would imagine her father's voice offering quiet encouragement. The weapons training at Bud-S was more advanced than anything Sarah had experienced before. They worked with pistols, rifles, machine guns, and explosives, often under conditions designed to simulate combat stress. Sarah's marksmanship continued to impress the instructors, but they pushed her to develop new skills, shooting while moving, engaging multiple targets rapidly, and making accurate shots while physically and mentally exhausted. During one memorable exercise, candidates had to complete a series of physical challenges and then immediately engage targets at various distances. Most of the class struggled to hit anything after being pushed to exhaustion, but Sarah's shots remained consistently accurate. Instructor Davis, who had been skeptical of her abilities from the beginning, stopped the exercise to examine her targets. "Martinez, how are you maintaining accuracy when everyone else is spraying bullets like a garden hose?" Sarah wiped sweat from her eyes before answering. "My father taught me that your breathing controls everything, Instructor Davis. If you can control your breathing, you can control your shots, even when your body is tired." Davis nodded thoughtfully. It was a simple principle, but one that many experienced shooters forgot under pressure. The fact that an exhausted candidate could articulate it clearly, while demonstrating its effectiveness, was impressive. Word of Sarah's performance was spreading beyond just the weapons instructors. The men who had initially viewed her presence as a distraction or publicity stunt were beginning to see her differently. She never complained, never asked for special treatment, and consistently performed at a level that earned respect. More importantly, she had demonstrated the kind of character that SEALs valued most: loyalty to teammates and refusal to quit when things got difficult. But Sarah knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Hell Week was approaching, and it was during those 5 days of almost continuous training that most candidates either proved they belonged or discovered they didn't. Everything she had endured so far had been preparation for this ultimate test of will, and she was determined to be ready. Hell Week arrived on a Monday morning that looked deceptively peaceful. The California sun was shining, the ocean was relatively calm, and nothing about the scene suggested that the next 5 days would push Sarah and her remaining classmates beyond anything they thought humanly possible. Of the original 230 candidates who had started Bud-S, only 78 remained, and Sarah knew that number would drop dramatically over the coming days. The week began at midnight Sunday with the sound of automatic weapons fire, explosions, and instructors screaming through bullhorns. Sarah jolted awake in her barracks room, disoriented and confused as smoke grenades filled the building and the chaos of simulated combat erupted around her. This was the beginning of Hell Week, 5.5 days during which candidates would get perhaps 4 hours of sleep total, while being pushed through the most demanding physical and mental challenges the military could devise. Get up, we're under attack!" Instructor Morrison's voice cut through the noise like a sword. Move, move, move!" Sarah and her teammates stumbled out of their bunks, grabbed their gear, and rushed outside into a scene that looked like a war zone. Instructors in combat gear were firing blank ammunition, setting off explosive charges, and hosing down everything with fire hoses. The message was clear: the comfortable world of regular training was over. For the next 5 days, they would be pushed beyond their breaking point to see who had the mental toughness to become a SEAL. The first challenge was a long ocean swim in the pre-dawn darkness. The water temperature was in the mid-50s, cold enough to cause hypothermia if candidates weren't careful. Sarah entered the water with her swim buddy, Petty Officer Chen, a quiet sailor from San Francisco who had become one of her closest allies during training. The swim would cover 2 miles, and they had to complete it within a specific time limit or face additional punishment. Halfway through the swim, Sarah began to struggle. The combination of cold water, fatigue from weeks of training, and the stress of Hell Week was taking its toll. Her stroke became less efficient, her breathing more labored, and she started to fall behind the required pace. Chen noticed immediately and adjusted his position to help break the current for her. "Stay with me, Martinez," he called out between strokes. "We're going to make this time limit." Sarah wanted to tell him to go ahead, to not sacrifice his own performance for her sake. But she also knew that SEALs never left teammates behind, even in training. She forced herself to find another gear, to push through the wall of exhaustion that was threatening to overwhelm her. Together, she and Chen finished the swim with 30 seconds to spare. The physical challenges came non-stop after that. Boat races where teams had to carry 200-pound rubber boats over their heads while running through soft sand. Log PT sessions where candidates had to lift, carry, and manipulate telephone poles weighing hundreds of pounds. Endless calisthenics performed in the surf until saltwater and sand covered every inch of their bodies. Sarah's smaller size became both a blessing and a curse during these exercises. She could perform bodyweight exercises like push-ups and pull-ups, long after larger candidates had reached muscle failure. But when it came to carrying boats and logs, she had to work twice as hard as everyone else to keep up. Her teammates began to compensate without being asked, positioning themselves to bear more of the load during team exercises. The sleep deprivation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of Hell Week. Candidates were lucky to get 30 minutes of rest at a time, and even then they were often woken up for surprise inspections or additional training. Sarah learned to fall asleep instantly whenever the opportunity arose, even if it was just for a few minutes while sitting in formation. Her body began to shut down non-essential functions to conserve energy. By Wednesday, hallucinations were becoming common among the candidates. Sarah started seeing movement in her peripheral vision that wasn't there, hearing conversations that weren't happening, and sometimes forgetting where she was or what exercise they were performing. During one particularly difficult log PT session, she became convinced that her father was standing on the beach shouting encouragement, only to realize it was actually an instructor yelling at them to work harder. The instructors were relentless in their psychological warfare. They would offer food to candidates who quit, show them pictures of comfortable beds, and constantly remind them that they could end the suffering simply by walking over and ringing the bell. The temptation was constant and grew stronger as the week progressed. Sarah watched good men, strong men, talented men ring out because they simply couldn't take another minute of the abuse. Thursday brought the medical checks that candidates both dreaded and prayed for. Navy medical personnel would examine each person for signs of serious injury or medical conditions that could be life-threatening if training continued. It was possible to be medically rolled back to a future class, which meant starting Hell Week over again, or medically dropped from training entirely. When the corpsman examined Sarah, he frowned at what he found. Her hands were covered in cuts and abrasions from handling boats and ropes. Her feet were a mess of blisters and raw skin from running in wet boots for days. Her body temperature was slightly below normal, and she showed signs of mild dehydration despite constant efforts to drink water. "How are you feeling, Martinez?" the corpsman asked. Sarah forced herself to stand straight and look alert, even though her body was screaming for rest. "Good to go, Doc. Ready for whatever comes next." The corpsman made some notes on his clipboard and looked at her for a long moment. He had seen hundreds of candidates come through Hell Week, and most of them looked far worse than Sarah did at this point. More importantly, her attitude and mental state seemed solid despite the physical toll the training was taking. "Keep an eye on those feet," he said finally, "and make sure you're drinking water regularly, but you're cleared to continue." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had made it through most of Hell Week without any serious injuries or medical issues, but she also knew that Friday would bring some of the most difficult challenges yet, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down now. The weapons training during Hell Week was unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. They had to demonstrate proficiency with various firearms while exhausted, cold, and operating on almost no sleep. The standards remained the same regardless of their physical condition. Every shot had to count, every weapon had to be properly maintained, and every safety protocol had to be followed perfectly. During one exercise, candidates had to disassemble, clean, and reassemble an M4 rifle while blindfolded, then immediately engage targets at various distances. Most of the class struggled with this task, their exhausted minds unable to remember the proper sequence of steps, or their shaking hands unable to perform the fine motor skills required. Sarah had an advantage here. She had been taking apart and cleaning firearms since she was 8 years old. Even in her current exhausted state, her hands seemed to know what to do without conscious thought. She completed the disassembly and cleaning quickly, then put the weapon back together and moved to the firing line. Her first shot hit dead center, in the target. So did her second, third, and fourth. By the time she had engaged all the targets, she had achieved a perfect score while most of her classmates were still struggling to hit the target at all. Instructor Morrison, who had been watching her performance closely all week, made another note in his records. "Outstanding weapons handling under stress conditions," he wrote. "Candidate maintains military bearing and tactical proficiency even when severely fatigued." But the weapons training also presented new challenges. They worked with explosives for the first time, learning how to handle C4 plastic explosive and other demolition materials. The margin for error was 0. A mistake with explosives could kill not just the candidate making the error, but everyone around them. Sarah approached this training with the same methodical precision she brought to firearms, double-checking every connection and following every safety protocol exactly. Friday morning brought rumors that Hell Week was almost over, but the instructors seemed determined to push everyone to their absolute breaking point in the final hours. The last major exercise was a long paddle in their rubber boats to a beach several miles up the coast, where they would have to complete additional challenges before paddling back. Sarah's boat crew had been reduced to 5 members after one candidate rang out Wednesday night. They were all exhausted, all operating on reserves they didn't know they had. But they had also developed the kind of trust and teamwork that only comes from shared suffering. When Sarah's paddle broke during the return journey, Chen immediately began sharing his paddle with her, alternating strokes so they could continue contributing to the team's progress. As they approached the beach at Coronado, Sarah could see a small crowd of instructors waiting for them. She knew that the moment they pulled their boat onto the sand, Hell Week would officially be over for those who had made it through. She had survived 5.5 days of the most demanding training the military had to offer, and she was still standing. As they approached the beach at Coronado, Sarah could see a small crowd of instructors waiting for them. She knew that the moment they pulled their boat onto the sand, Hell Week would officially be over for those who had made it through. She had survived 5.5 days of the most demanding training the military had to offer, and she was still standing. When her feet touched the sand, Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and pride, unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had proven something to herself, to the instructors, and to everyone who had doubted whether a woman could survive Hell Week. But she also knew that this was just one milestone in a much longer journey. Hell Week was over, but Bud's training would continue, and every day would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself worthy of wearing the seal trident. The weeks following Hell Week brought a different kind of challenge to Sarah and the 38 candidates who remained from the original class of 230. The physical torture was largely over, replaced by increasingly complex training that would teach them the specialized skills every SEAL needed to master. But it was during this phase that Sarah encountered her most serious obstacles yet, not from the training itself, but from politics and prejudice that threatened to derail everything she had worked for. The second phase of Bud's focused on combat diving and underwater operations. Sarah had always been a competent swimmer, but the technical diving they were learning was far more demanding than anything she had experienced. They worked with closed-circuit breathing apparatus that left no bubbles on the surface, learned to navigate underwater using only compass bearings, and practiced complex military operations while completely submerged. The diving physics came naturally to Sarah. She had always been good at math and science, and understanding the relationships between depth, pressure, and gas consumption was just another equation to solve. What proved more challenging was the physical demands of working underwater, while carrying heavy equipment and performing complex tasks. During one training evolution, candidates had to swim to the bottom of a 50-foot pool, locate a simulated mine, attach a demolition charge, and return to the surface without being detected by instructors playing the role of enemy sentries. Sarah descended smoothly, her movements economical to conserve oxygen. But when she reached the target, she discovered that the simulated mine was much heavier than expected. The device weighed nearly 40 pounds and was designed to test the candidate's ability to work effectively underwater while managing their air supply and physical exertion. Sarah's smaller frame meant she had to work harder than her larger classmates to manipulate the heavy equipment, but she had learned to use technique rather than brute strength to accomplish difficult tasks. She positioned herself carefully, used her legs to brace against the pool bottom, and methodically attached the training charge exactly as they had been taught. Her movements were deliberate and controlled, wasting no energy on unnecessary actions. When she finally surfaced, her air consumption readings were actually better than most of her classmates, despite the extra effort required due to her size. Instructor Petty Officer Davis, who had been one of her harshest critics early in training, reviewed her performance scores with obvious surprise. Sarah had not only completed the exercise successfully, but had done so more efficiently than candidates who outweighed her by 70 pounds. Her technical proficiency was becoming impossible to ignore, but it was during the land warfare phase that Sarah truly began to shine. The third phase of Bud's focused on weapons, tactics, and small unit operations, skills that would form the foundation of everything SEALs did in combat. Sarah's marksmanship had been impressive from the beginning, but now she was learning advanced techniques that few people outside special operations ever mastered. The sniper training was particularly demanding. Candidates had to demonstrate the ability to make precise shots at extended distances, while accounting for wind, humidity, temperature, and dozens of other variables that could affect bullet trajectory. They worked with rifles that cost more than most people's cars, using optics so sophisticated they seemed like science fiction to someone who had learned to shoot with basic iron sights. Sarah's first day on the advanced marksmanship range drew a crowd of instructors who had heard about her shooting abilities but hadn't seen them demonstrated at this level. The targets were placed at distances ranging from 300 to 800 yards, ranges where even a tiny error in technique would result in a complete miss. Lying prone behind her rifle, Sarah went through the same mental checklist her father had taught her years ago. Breathing, sight alignment, natural point of aim, trigger control. The fundamentals were the same whether she was shooting at a target 50 feet away or 800 yards distant. The only difference was the margin for error, which became smaller as the distances increased. Her first shot at 300 yards hit the center of the target. The 500-yard shot was equally precise. At 600 yards, where many experienced shooters began to struggle, Sarah's bullet struck within inches of the bullseye. By the time she engaged the 800-yard target, a small crowd had gathered to watch. The shot felt perfect as it left the rifle. Sarah could tell immediately that her technique had been flawless. The rifle recoiled straight back, the crosshairs remained on target, and every aspect of the shot execution had been exactly as it should be. Through the spotting scope, the instructors could see that her bullet had struck dead center in the target, a shot that would have been impressive for a professional sniper, let alone a trainee. Chief Morrison walked over to where Sarah was lying behind her rifle. For the first time since she had arrived at Bud's, his expression showed something approaching approval. "Where did you learn to shoot like that, Martinez?" "My father started teaching me when I was 8, Chief," Sarah replied, keeping her rifle pointed downrange as she had been trained. He said that marksmanship was about discipline and consistency, not strength or size. Morrison nodded slowly. He had been a SEAL sniper for several years before moving to instructor duty, and he recognized exceptional shooting when he saw it. Sarah's performance wasn't just good for a female candidate or good for someone her size. It was simply good, period. In combat situations, that level of marksmanship could mean the difference between mission success and failure, between bringing teammates home alive and leaving them behind. But Sarah's success on the range also created new problems. Word of her shooting abilities spread throughout the naval special warfare community, and not everyone was pleased with what they were hearing. Phone calls were made, meetings were held, and pressure began to build from sources Sarah never even knew existed. The first sign of trouble came when Admiral Richardson, the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, made an unscheduled visit to the Bud's compound. Richardson was a political animal who understood that having the first female SEAL could either be a public relations triumph or a disaster, depending on how it was handled. He wanted to see this candidate for himself before making any decisions about her future. Sarah was called into Morrison's office on a Thursday afternoon, still wearing her training uniform and smelling like salt water and cordite from the morning's exercises. Richardson sat behind Morrison's desk, his uniform pristine and his expression unreadable. Morrison stood at attention nearby, clearly uncomfortable with having his chain of command disrupted. "Sit down, Martinez," Richardson said without preamble. "I've been hearing interesting things about your performance here." Sarah took the offered chair and waited for the Admiral to continue. She had learned early in military life that when senior officers wanted to talk, junior personnel's job was to listen. "Your shooting scores are exceptional," Richardson continued, flipping through a folder that contained her training records. "Your physical performance has been adequate, and your instructors tell me you've shown good leadership qualities. But I'm concerned about the attention your presence here is generating." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had been so focused on meeting the training standards that she hadn't considered the political implications of her success. "Sir, I'm just trying to complete the training like everyone else." Richardson smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "That's exactly the problem, Martinez. You're not like everyone else, and pretending otherwise is naive. Every reporter in the country wants to interview you. Politicians are asking questions about our training standards. Foreign militaries are watching to see if we're lowering our requirements to accommodate women." The Admiral leaned forward in his chair. I need to know, Martinez. Are you here to become a SEAL? Or are you here to prove a point about women's rights? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Everything she had endured, the mockery, the extra scrutiny, the constant pressure to perform better than everyone else, had been based on her desire to serve her country as a SEAL. The idea that anyone would question her motives was both insulting and heartbreaking. Sir, I'm here because I believe I can serve effectively as a naval special warfare operator, she replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the emotions churning inside her. I want to be judged by the same standards as every other candidate, nothing more and nothing less. Richardson studied her for a long moment before closing her training folder. The problem is, Martinez, that's not how the world works. Whether you graduate or not, your presence here is changing things. Some people think that's good, others think it's dangerous. I need to decide which group is right. After the Admiral left, Morrison remained in his office for several minutes without speaking. Finally, he looked at Sarah and shook his head. You're in a tough spot, Martinez. There are people who want you to succeed just to make history, and there are people who want you to fail to preserve tradition. Either way, you're being judged by criteria that have nothing to do with whether you can do the job. Sarah left that meeting with a heavy heart, knowing that her performance in training was only part of the challenge she faced. Forces beyond her control were making decisions about her future, and all she could do was continue training and hope that her abilities would speak louder than politics. But she was beginning to understand that becoming the first female SEAL would require more than just meeting the standards. It would require navigating a complex web of expectations and agendas that had little to do with military effectiveness. Final weeks of Bud-S training brought both triumph and controversy, as Sarah approached the finish line that had seemed impossible when she first walked into that recruitment office in Texas. The political pressure surrounding her candidacy had intensified, with congressional hearings being scheduled and media outlets camping outside the gates of the Coronado base. But inside the training compound, Sarah remained focused on the one thing she could control: her own performance. The culminating exercise of Bud-S was a complex mission that would test everything the candidates had learned over the previous 6 months. Working in small teams, they had to plan and execute a simulated combat operation that included underwater infiltration, land warfare, and precision weapons employment. Sarah found herself assigned as the team leader for her 6-man squad, a role that would put her decision-making and leadership abilities under intense scrutiny. The mission briefing took place in a secure classroom where Sarah and her teammates studied satellite photographs, intelligence reports, and tactical maps. Their objective was to infiltrate a simulated enemy compound, eliminate specific high-value targets, and extract without detection. It was the kind of operation that real SEAL teams conducted in hostile territory around the world, and the margin for error was intentionally small. Sarah's team consisted of some of the strongest candidates remaining in the class. Chen, her swim buddy from Hell Week, would handle underwater navigation. Thompson, the former football player who had initially doubted her abilities, was their demolitions expert. Jackson, Williams, and Martinez rounded out the squad with their own specialized skills. These men had learned to trust Sarah's judgment over the months of training, but they also knew that their final exercise performance would heavily influence whether they graduated. The planning phase revealed Sarah's analytical mind and attention to detail. While some team leaders focused primarily on the action phases of the mission, Sarah insisted on developing multiple contingency plans for everything that could go wrong. She studied the target area until she could navigate it blindfolded, identified alternative extraction routes, and established communication protocols that would allow the team to adapt if their primary plan failed. Martinez is overthinking this, one of the other team leaders commented during a break in the planning session. It's just a training exercise, not a real mission. Thompson, who had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters, overheard the comment and shook his head. That's exactly why she's going to succeed and you might not, he replied. She treats everything like it's real because when we get out there, it will be real. The mission began at 2200 hours on a moonless Thursday night. Sarah's team slipped into the Pacific Ocean from a small boat 2 miles offshore, each man carrying over 60 pounds of equipment in addition to their diving gear. The water was cold and rough, with 4-foot swells that made swimming difficult and navigation challenging. Sarah led from the front, using a compass and timing to guide the team toward their insertion point on the beach. Underwater navigation in combat conditions was one of the most demanding skills in the SEAL repertoire. A small error in heading or timing could put the team miles off course, compromising the entire mission. Sarah had to account for ocean currents, tidal flows, and the natural tendency for swimmers to drift off course when they couldn't see their destination. After 45 minutes of swimming, she made the decision to surface and check their position. The GPS reading showed they were less than 50 meters from their intended insertion point, an accuracy that impressed even the instructors who were monitoring the exercise from nearby boats. Sarah's team was the first to reach the beach, and they were precisely where they needed to be to begin the land phase of their mission. Moving inland, Sarah's squad had to traverse 2 miles of rough terrain while avoiding simulated enemy patrols and sensor networks. The instructors had positioned motion detectors, infrared cameras, and human observers throughout the area to test the candidates' ability to move undetected. Sarah used techniques she had learned from her father's hunting trips, combined with advanced military tactics, to guide her team through the defensive perimeter without triggering any alarms. The target compound was a collection of buildings that had been constructed specifically for SEAL training exercises. Inside, role-playing instructors represented high-value targets that had to be eliminated with precision shots from specific locations. The challenge was getting into position without alerting the guards, making the required shots and extracting before enemy reinforcements could respond. Sarah positioned her team members at carefully selected firing positions around the compound. Each man had a specific target and a narrow window of time in which to take his shot. The synchronization had to be perfect. If anyone fired too early or too late, the simulation would show that enemy forces had been alerted, and the mission would be scored as a failure. "All teams report ready," Sarah whispered into her radio headset. One by one, her team members confirmed that they were in position and had clear shots on their assigned targets. Sarah checked her own rifle one final time, verifying that her scope was properly adjusted and that she had a clear line of sight to her target 400 yards away. The shot would have to be perfect, not just accurate, but timed precisely with her teammates' shots to maintain the element of surprise. "Execute, execute, execute," Sarah commanded. 6 rifles fired within a fraction of a second of each other. Through her scope, Sarah watched her bullet strike the target exactly where she had aimed. Around the compound, the other targets fell simultaneously as her teammates' shots found their marks. The precision and timing were flawless, exactly the kind of performance that separated SEALs from other military units. The extraction phase tested the team's ability to move quickly while maintaining security. Sarah led her squad back toward the beach using a different route than their insertion path, avoiding areas where enemy forces would be searching for them. The 2-mile movement had to be completed within 30 minutes to meet the mission timeline, which meant moving fast while still maintaining noise and light discipline. As they reached the beach, Sarah could see the small boat that would extract them waiting in the surf zone. But the instructors had one final challenge. Simulated enemy forces were converging on their location, and the team had to provide covering fire while boarding the boat under pressure. Sarah positioned her men in a defensive perimeter and coordinated their movement to the extraction vessel, ensuring that everyone made it aboard before the exercise ended. The boat ride back to Coronado was subdued. Sarah and her team knew they had performed well, but they also knew that their BUD/S training was essentially over. After 6 months of the most demanding military training in the world, they would either graduate or be sent to other Navy assignments. For Sarah, the stakes were even higher. She would either become the first female Navy SEAL or become a cautionary tale about women in combat roles. The graduation ceremony took place on a Friday morning in front of families, friends, and media, representatives from around the world. Of the original 230 candidates who had started BUD/S, only 23 were graduating. Sarah stood in formation with her classmates, wearing the dress blue uniform that she had earned through months of sacrifice and determination. Admiral Richardson delivered The graduation address, speaking about the traditions of naval special warfare and the responsibilities that came with joining such an elite organization. When he began calling names for the presentation of certificates, Sarah felt her heart pounding with anticipation. Petty Officer Second Class Sarah Martinez, Richardson announced. Sarah stepped forward and saluted as the Admiral handed her the certificate that officially marked her completion of Bud-S training. The applause from the audience was thunderous, and she could see her parents in the crowd, her father standing at attention and her mother crying tears of joy and pride. Sarah stepped forward and saluted as the Admiral handed her the certificate that officially marked her completion of Bud-S training. The applause from the audience was thunderous, and she could see her parents in the crowd, her father standing at attention and her mother crying tears of joy and pride. But Sarah knew that graduating from Buds was only the beginning. She still had to complete SEAL qualification training, earn her warfare designation, and prove herself worthy of assignment to an operational team. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but she had already overcome obstacles that most people thought impossible. As the ceremony concluded and she posed for photographs with her classmates, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had endured mockery, doubt, and political pressure, but she had never lost sight of her goal. She had proven that determination, skill, and character mattered more than gender when it came to serving her country in the most demanding military role possible. The laughter of those who had doubted her seemed very distant now. Sarah Martinez had silenced her critics not with words, but with performance that spoke louder than any argument ever could. She was a Navy SEAL, and she had earned that title through the same standards and the same sacrifices as every man who had come before her.